Rome had seen plenty of scandalous imperial weddings, but nothing prepared the city for what happened in 67 AD. Emperor Nero, ruler of the known world, stood at the altar wearing traditional groom's attire. Beside him stood his bride, draped in the saffron wedding veil, reserved for Roman brides, wearing the jewelry and makeup of an empress. The bride's name was Sporus. The bride was a teenage boy who had been castrated specifically for this ceremony. This wasn't some private perversion hidden behind palace walls. Nero married Sporus in a full public ceremony, complete with dowry, marriage contract, and wedding feast attended by Rome's elite. The boy wore the clothes, jewelry, and hairstyle of Poppaea Sabina, Nero's deceased wife, whom he had allegedly kicked to death while she was pregnant. Sporus wasn't just becoming Nero's consort, he was being transformed into a replacement for a dead woman. The castration had been performed months earlier. Physicians had removed Sporus's testicles completely, ensuring he would never develop into a man. His voice would remain high, his face smooth, his body soft and feminine. Nero had personally overseen the procedure, selecting the most skilled surgeons to preserve the boy's beauty while destroying his manhood. The physical trauma was immense. Sporus spent weeks recovering from the mutilation, barely able to walk, the pain so severe that he could barely eat or sleep. But the physical castration was just preparation. The real transformation came in the months leading up to the wedding. Sporus was dressed daily in Poppaea's actual clothing, items that still carried her scent. Makeup artists who had once served the empress now painted Sporus's face to match hers. Hairstylists recreated her elaborate hairstyles on his head. He was taught to walk like her, gesture like her, even modulate his already high voice to sound more like hers. During the wedding ceremony, senators and military commanders were forced to attend, to witness their emperor marrying a castrated teenage boy dressed as his dead wife. They offered the traditional congratulations through gritted teeth. They toasted the happy couple while their stomachs turned. To refuse attendance was treason. To show disgust was death. So Rome's most powerful men stood silently while their emperor violated every social, religious, and moral boundary their civilization had established. The wedding feast lasted 3 days. Throughout the celebration, Nero publicly fondled and kissed Sporus, calling him "my Poppaea, return to me." Guests were forced to address Sporus as empress, to bow before him, to treat this mutilated boy as if he were actually the reincarnation of Nero's murdered wife. Some senators later wrote in private letters that they felt they were witnessing the final collapse of Roman civilization. But here's what nobody understood during that grotesque ceremony. The wedding wasn't the worst part of what would happen to Sporus. It was just the beginning. Because being Nero's bride meant something far more horrifying than anyone watching could imagine. After the wedding, Sporus discovered the true nature of his new existence. He wasn't just expected to dress like Poppaea. He was required to become her completely. Every morning, servants woke him before dawn to begin the transformation. They bathed him in oils and perfumes that Poppaea had favored. They painted his face with the exact cosmetics she had used, applying each layer precisely as her makeup artists remembered. They dressed him in her actual clothes, jewelry that still bore her fingerprints, shoes that had molded to her feet. Nero had kept everything from Poppaea's chambers untouched after her death. Now Sporus lived in those rooms, surrounded by her possessions, sleeping in her bed, using her furniture. The emperor had created a twisted shrine, and Sporus was the living centerpiece. He was forbidden from removing the makeup, even to sleep. Forbidden from wearing any clothing but hers. Forbidden from speaking in his natural voice. Every moment of every day, he was required to maintain the illusion that Poppaea had somehow returned. The psychological torture was relentless. Nero would spend hours staring at Sporus, comparing him to his memories of Poppaea. If a gesture wasn't quite right, if the voice was slightly off, if the makeup didn't match his memory perfectly, Nero would fly into rages. Sometimes these rages meant beatings, other times they meant forced starvation as punishment. Sporus learned to study every tiny detail of how Poppaea had moved, spoken, and behaved, recreating a dead woman's mannerisms with desperate precision. But the worst violations happened during imperial banquets. Nero would display Sporus to guests, forcing him to recline beside the emperor while being groped and fondled throughout the meal. Senators and their wives were required to make conversation with Sporus as if he were actually the empress. They had to compliment his appearance, ask about his well-being, treat the entire grotesque charade as normal. Some guests later reported feeling physically ill, having to participate in this theater of the absurd. Nero's sexual demands were constant and degrading. The emperor would call for Sporus at any hour, requiring him to perform while dressed in Poppaea's nightclothes. Sometimes Nero would cry during these encounters, calling out Poppaea's name, treating Sporus not as a person, but as a vessel for his dead wife's memory. Other times, Nero would become violent, angry that Sporus wasn't exactly like Poppaea, punishing the boy for the simple fact that he existed as a replacement rather than the real thing. The palace staff watched this horror unfold with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Some servants tried to show Sporus small kindnesses, but they had to be careful. Nero had spies everywhere, and anyone caught treating Sporus as a boy rather than as the empress could be executed. So Sporus existed in complete isolation, surrounded by people, but utterly alone, his original identity erased, forced to inhabit the role of a woman he had never known. The most disturbing aspect was how completely Sporus's previous life had been erased. His birth name was forgotten. His family, if he had one, never mentioned again. The boy he had been before the castration had been deliberately destroyed, replaced by this twisted recreation of Nero's dead wife. Court records from the period refer to him only as Sporus, never giving any indication of who he had been before Nero chose him for this fate. Months passed this way, then years. Sporus existed in a constant state of performance, never allowed to drop the mask, never permitted a moment of genuine existence. His body had been mutilated, his identity had been stolen, his entire life had become a monument to Nero's obsessive grief and perverse desires. He was the emperor's most prized possession, and like all possessions, he had no will of his own. But empires don't last forever. And when Nero's reign finally began to crumble, Sporus would discover that being the emperor's favorite toy came with consequences far worse than anything he had already endured. In 68 AD, everything collapsed. Rebellions erupted across the empire. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. As Rome burned with political chaos, Nero fled the palace with a handful of loyal servants. He took Sporus with him. Even while running for his life, the emperor couldn't abandon his precious toy. When Nero finally committed suicide, stabbing himself in the throat while weeping, Sporus stood nearby, still dressed in Poppaea's clothes, watching the man who had destroyed his life bleed out in a suburban villa. For a brief moment, Sporus might have believed he was free. The monster was dead. Perhaps he could remove the makeup, burn the dresses, reclaim whatever fragments of his original identity remained. But Sporus had become too valuable. He wasn't just a castrated boy anymore. He was a symbol, a living connection to Nero's reign, a political asset that powerful men could use to legitimize their claims to the throne. Otho seized power next. He had been one of Nero's closest friends, and he had coveted Sporus for years. Now, as the new emperor, Otho claimed Sporus for himself. The boy discovered that freedom was an illusion. He was simply changing owners. Otho insisted that Sporus continue wearing Poppaea's clothes and makeup. The new emperor wanted the same fantasy that Nero had created, the same twisted performance. Sporus went from Nero's bed to Otho's bed without even a day of respite. But Otho's motivations were different and somehow more calculating. He didn't love Poppaea's memory the way Nero had. He wanted Sporus because possessing Nero's wife gave him legitimacy. By keeping Sporus as his consort, Otho was signaling to Rome that he was Nero's rightful successor. Sporus had become a political prop, his mutilated body serving as evidence of imperial continuity. The boy who had been castrated for love was now being displayed for power. Otho paraded Sporus through Rome, showing off his acquisition. The message was clear. I possess what Nero possessed, therefore I possess Nero's authority. Senators who had been forced to bow to Sporus under Nero now had to bow to him again, under Otho. The humiliation was endless and cyclical. Every public appearance reminded Sporus that he would never escape this role, that he would be passed from emperor to emperor like an inherited piece of furniture. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months. Vitellius, commanding legions from Germany, marched on Rome and defeated Otho's forces. When Otho committed suicide, Sporus found himself facing yet another emperor, and this one had very different plans for Nero's famous toy. Vitellius didn't want Sporus as a consort. He wanted him as entertainment. The new emperor looked at this castrated boy who had been married to Nero and saw an opportunity for the most spectacular public humiliation Rome had ever witnessed. Vitellius announced his intention to stage a theatrical performance in the arena. Sporus would play the role of Proserpina, the goddess who was abducted and raped by Pluto, god of the underworld. The performance wouldn't be symbolic or metaphorical. It would be real. Sporus would be dressed as the goddess and then publicly raped in front of thousands of spectators. This was how Vitellius planned to symbolically destroy Nero's legacy by having Nero's bride violated before all of Rome. The preparations began immediately. Sporus was measured for an elaborate costume, draped in fabric meant to represent divine beauty. Makeup artists were commissioned to make him look as much like classical depictions of Proserpina as possible. The arena was being prepared for the spectacle. Advertisements went out across the city. Rome's citizens were invited to watch the defilement of the boy who had been married to their most hated emperor. Sporus was kept under constant guard in the palace, prevented from escaping or harming himself before the performance. He could hear the construction in the arena, the hammering and sawing as workers built the set for his public rape. He could hear guards discussing the event, placing bets on how long he would survive, joking about what they would do if given the chance to participate. The entire city was anticipating his destruction, as if it were a holiday celebration. In those days of waiting, Sporus must have understood the full scope of his tragedy. He had been castrated for an emperor's fantasy. He had been forced to impersonate a dead woman for years. He had been passed between rulers like property. And now he was going to be raped in public as entertainment for the masses. His entire existence had been one long violation, and it was about to reach its ultimate conclusion in front of thousands of cheering spectators. But Sporus still had one choice left, one final act of autonomy in a life that had been completely controlled by others, and he was about to take it. The night before the scheduled performance, Sporus was kept in a guarded chamber deep within the imperial palace. Soldiers stood outside his door. Servants brought him the elaborate costume he was supposed to wear, the flowing robes and jewelry that would transform him into Proserpina. They laid out the makeup, the oils, everything needed to prepare him for his final public appearance. Vitellius had given explicit orders. Sporus was to be made beautiful one last time before being destroyed. The servants left him alone to prepare. The guards remained outside, confident that a castrated boy posed no threat, that he would submit to his fate as he had submitted to everything else. They didn't understand what years of degradation had built inside Sporus. They didn't realize that a person with nothing left to lose becomes capable of anything. While they stood outside discussing the next day's spectacle, Sporus was making a decision that would be his first and last act of true free will. Among the cosmetics and oils left for his preparation, there were small blades used for trimming hair and shaping eyebrows. Sporus took one. It wasn't much of a weapon, barely larger than a fingernail, but it was sharp enough for what he intended. He sat in that chamber, surrounded by the costume meant to transform him into a goddess about to be raped, and he made a choice. He would not give Vitellius the satisfaction. He would not provide entertainment for Rome's bloodthirsty crowds. He would deny them all the spectacle they craved. Historical accounts don't record his final thoughts. We don't know if he felt relief or terror. We don't know if he hesitated or acted immediately. What we know is that Sporus cut his own throat with that tiny blade, sawing through his flesh with desperate determination. The wound wasn't clean or quick. It took time. He had to keep cutting, keep tearing at his own neck, fighting through pain and instinct, forcing himself to complete the act before guards could stop him. When the servants returned to help him dress for the performance, they found him on the floor, still wearing Papia's clothes, surrounded by spreading pools of blood. The tiny cosmetic blade lay beside him, slick with gore. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. The boy who had been castrated, married to an emperor, passed between rulers like property, and scheduled for public rape, had found the only escape available to him. He had killed himself, rather than endure one more violation. The guards panicked. Vitellius had ordered a spectacle, and now his main attraction was dead. They sent for physicians, but everyone knew it was pointless. Sporus had cut deep enough that no medical intervention of the era could have saved him. He had made certain of his own death with the same thoroughness he had once used to perfect his impersonation of Poppaea. This final performance was his alone, and he had executed it flawlessly. Vitellius flew into a rage when informed of the suicide. He had promised Rome a show, had advertised the event throughout the city, had built elaborate sets in the arena. Thousands of citizens were expecting to watch Sporus's humiliation and rape. Now the emperor looked like a fool, his grand spectacle ruined by a dead, castrated boy. The rage wasn't about Sporus's suffering or the loss of a human life. It was about the embarrassment, the political damage, the missed opportunity to cement power through public degradation. The emperor ordered that Sporus receive no proper burial. His body would not be cremated with honors or placed in a tomb. There would be no funeral rites, no period of mourning, no acknowledgement of his humanity. Vitellius wanted Sporus erased from history, wanted to punish him even in death for denying Rome its entertainment. The boy's corpse was to be disposed of like garbage, thrown away and forgotten. For days, Sporus's body lay unattended. Palace servants were forbidden from touching it. No family came forward to claim him, probably because he had no family left, or because they were too terrified to associate themselves with someone who had been Nero's consort. The corpse remained where it had fallen, still dressed in the costume meant for his rape performance, the blood dried and blackened around the gaping wound in his throat. Eventually, palace workers were ordered to remove the body. They carried it out of the palace under cover of darkness, not with ceremony or respect, but like refuse being taken to a dump. Rome's citizens, who had been eagerly anticipating watching this boy be raped in public, never got their show. Instead, they got whispers about a suicide, rumors about a body thrown into an unmarked grave. Nothing satisfying or entertaining about it. What happened next would prove that even death couldn't free Sporus from the cruelty of the empire he had been forced to serve. Sporus's corpse was carried through Rome's streets in the middle of the night. No funeral procession, no mourners. Just palace workers hauling a body wrapped in cheap cloth, trying to complete their grim task as quickly as possible. They had been given explicit instructions from Vitellius. Dispose of Nero's toy without ceremony, without respect, without acknowledging that he had ever been anything more than an object for imperial entertainment. The workers threw the body into a common grave pit on the outskirts of Rome, a mass burial site used for executed criminals, unclaimed bodies, and anyone deemed unworthy of proper Roman funeral rites. No marker was placed. No name was recorded. Sporus, who had been displayed before all of Rome as an empress, who had worn imperial jewelry and lived in palace chambers, who had been the obsessive focus of an emperor's love, was dumped into the ground like trash. But Vitellius wasn't satisfied with mere disposal. He issued an edict that anyone who mourned Sporus or spoke favorably of him would face treason charges. The emperor wanted the boy erased not just from the physical world, but from memory itself. No statues of Sporus existed, unlike other imperial consorts. Nero had commissioned paintings and sculptures, but these had been destroyed during the chaos following his death. The few remaining images were now hunted down and burned. What made Sporus's fate even more grotesque was how public figures who had once bowed to him now competed to denounce him. Senators who had been forced to address him as empress now gave speeches condemning him as a perversion, a symbol of Nero's degeneracy, proof that the previous reign had been cursed by the gods. These same men had eaten at banquets where Sporus sat beside Nero, had complimented his appearance, had participated in the charade. Now they pretended they had always been disgusted, rewriting their own complicity into righteous opposition. The common people of Rome, who had been eagerly awaiting his public rape and humiliation, felt cheated by his suicide. Street graffiti mocked him for dying too soon. Poets wrote crude verses about his cowardice, calling him too weak to face the punishment he deserved. Nobody acknowledged that the punishment was rape, that what Rome had been eagerly anticipating was watching a castrated teenager be sexually tortured to death as entertainment. For weeks after his death, Sporus remained a topic of vulgar jokes and contemptuous gossip. His suicide was treated as the final act of weakness in a life defined by degradation. People who had never known him, who had only heard stories about Nero's castrated bride, now felt entitled to judge his final choice. The consensus seemed to be that Sporus had gotten what he deserved, that a boy who had allowed himself to be turned into an empress deserved no better fate than an unmarked grave. Historical records from the period mention Sporus only in passing, usually as a footnote to Nero's excesses, or as an example of how depraved the previous reign had been. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and Suetonius mention him briefly, focusing on the scandal of the castration and marriage, but showing no interest in Sporus as a person. To them, he was just another bizarre detail in the catalogue of Nero's crimes, not a human being who had suffered. The common grave where Sporus was thrown eventually filled with other bodies. Layers of dead criminals, plague victims, and paupers were piled on top of him. Within months, nobody could have said exactly where in that mass of decomposing flesh Sporus's body lay. He became indistinguishable from all the other forgotten dead, just another set of bones in Rome's endless supply of corpses. Palace servants who had witnessed his daily humiliations never spoke about it. The makeup artists who had painted his face, the hairdressers who had styled him to look like Poppaea, the guards who had watched him being paraded through the palace, all of them stayed silent. Speaking about Sporus meant acknowledging complicity in his torture. It was easier to forget, to pretend they had never participated in his degradation. Years passed. New emperors rose and fell. Rome moved on to fresh scandals and new atrocities. The story of the emperor's castrated bride became a whispered anecdote, something shocking but distant, divorced from the reality of what had actually happened to a teenage boy. Nobody remembered his original name. Nobody knew if he had family who grieved for him. Nobody cared that he had spent years being forced to impersonate a dead woman while being sexually used by multiple emperors. But death wasn't the end of Sporus's humiliation. Because even centuries after his suicide, his story would be told and retold in ways that stripped away any remaining dignity, turning his suffering into entertainment for future generations. Centuries after Sporus's death, his story survived in the writings of Roman historians, but the way they told it revealed something disturbing about how Rome remembered its victims. Suetonius, writing decades after these events, described the castration and marriage in vivid detail but showed no sympathy for the boy involved. He presented Sporus as a curiosity, a bizarre footnote to Nero's reign, something shocking but ultimately meaningless. Cassius Dio's account was even worse. He described Sporus with contempt, calling him willing participant in his own degradation. The historical record suggested that a teenage boy had somehow chosen to be castrated, chosen to be married to an emperor, chosen to spend years impersonating a dead woman. This was how Rome dealt with uncomfortable truths. By blaming the victim, by suggesting that those who suffered degradation must have secretly desired it. What makes this historical erasure so vicious is that we don't even know Sporus's real name. The name Sporus itself was likely a Roman nickname, possibly derived from a Greek word meaning seed or semen, a cruel joke about his castration. His actual birth name, the name his parents gave him, was lost. The boy he had been before Nero selected him for this fate was completely erased, replaced by a nickname that mocked his mutilation. Modern historians trying to research Sporus find almost nothing beyond brief mentions in ancient sources. We don't know where he was born. We don't know how old he was when castrated. We don't know if he had family, friends, or any life before becoming Nero's toy. Everything about his actual humanity was deliberately destroyed, leaving only the scandalous outline of his story. Castrated boy, married to emperor, passed between rulers, committed suicide. Archaeological excavations have found no trace of him. Unlike other imperial consorts who were buried in elaborate tombs, Sporus left no physical evidence of his existence. His body, dumped in that common grave, has long since decomposed into nothing. The mass burial site where he was thrown was eventually built over, erased by Rome's endless construction and renovation. Even his bones are gone, mixed into the soil beneath modern buildings. What survives is only the scandal, the shock value of his story. For 2,000 years, people have repeated the tale of Nero's castrated bride, always focusing on the grotesque details. The public wedding, the impersonation of a dead woman, the passing between emperors. But nobody asks what it felt like to be Sporus. Nobody wonders about the terror of waking up every day knowing you had no control over your body, your identity, or your future. The cruelest irony is that Sporus's only act of genuine autonomy, his suicide, was treated as weakness rather than courage. He had endured castration without choice. He had endured years of sexual slavery without escape. He had been passed between emperors like property. But when he finally took control of his own fate, when he denied Rome its entertainment by killing himself, that act was recorded as cowardice rather than defiance. Think about what Sporus's life actually was. He was a teenager, probably around 13 or 14 when Nero selected him. He was castrated, deliberately mutilated to preserve physical features that pleased an emperor. He was dressed in a dead woman's clothes and forced to impersonate her for years. He was sexually used by multiple emperors. He was scheduled to be publicly raped as entertainment. And when he finally killed himself to avoid that final humiliation, his body was thrown into a mass grave and his memory was erased. This is what absolute power looks like. Not the glamorous version shown in movies, but the grinding reality of what happens when one human being has complete control over another. Sporus wasn't a tragic lover or a willing participant in some exotic romance. He was a child who was mutilated and enslaved, whose body was used until it was scheduled for public destruction, who died alone in a palace chamber surrounded by the costume meant for his rape. Rome built an empire on stories of glory and conquest, on narratives of civilization and progress. But the truth was always there in the margins, in the brief mentions of boys like Sporus, whose suffering was so unremarkable that historians barely bothered to record it. He was just one castrated teenager in an empire that routinely brutalized thousands. His story survived only because he happened to be connected to famous emperors, not because anyone cared about his actual suffering. The boy who was castrated, married, and passed between emperors never had a chance to be human. He was transformed into an object, a symbol, a political tool, and finally into entertainment that never quite happened. And when he died, Rome threw him away like garbage and tried to forget he ever existed. But the forgetting was never complete. His story survived, not as a memorial to his suffering, but as a scandalous anecdote. One more shocking tale from the depraved history of imperial Rome. 2,000 years later, we still don't know his real name. We still don't know where he came from or what he might have become if Nero had never noticed him. All we know is the outline of his nightmare. A boy who became an empress who became property, and property that chose death over one final violation. That was Sporus. That was the emperor's toy.